Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from New Energy, I'm talking about the 2006 album from The Knife, Silent Shout. Alright then, The Knife. That's the well-acclaimed Swedish synth-pop duo of siblings Karen and Olof Dreyer, who were active through the 2000s and early 2010s, although disbanded in 2014. Karen Dreyer went on to have an equally successful solo career performing under the name Fever Ray. This is one of those acts that I've known about for ages. They'd gotten acclaim from pretty much every music outlet under the sun, but I personally mostly knew about them through Anthony Fantano, who really hyped them up back in the day. Fever Ray's self-titled was his album of the year in the first year he started doing reviews in 2009, and he gave a similarly glowing review to The Knife's final album, Shaking the Habitual, in 2013, even if he also went on record saying that album shrunk on him later. Although, as much as I'd seen their name around all the time and given loads of praise from all sorts of critical outlets, I'd never actually bothered to look into them in depth before starting work on this video. Before this, the only knife-related work I'd personally listened to myself was Karen Dreyer's guest appearances on Röyksopp tracks, such as What Else Is There, This Must Be It, and Tricky Tricky. And in the former of those three tracks, I had spent a possibly embarrassing amount of time mistaking Dreyer for Björk. In my defense, I think it is an understandable mistake to make if you're not looking the credits up. Karen Dreyer's voice sounds very similar to Björk's, and I am far from the first person to directly make the comparison. Although, it's obviously not like a one-to-one exact match. Dreyer definitely has more of a shrill and sharp tone to their voice, while Björk's voice has more dynamic range and power, I guess. The somewhat more limited, piercing, drill-like quality to Karen Dreyer's voice is even more of an acquired taste than Björk's. There will be plenty of times where they start pushing into maybe annoying territory, or occasionally making themselves hard to take seriously. Tricky Tricky was never one of my favorite tracks on Röyksopp's Jr. for that reason, like the 6 afraid of 7, 'cause 7, 8, 9 hook on that one was pretty dang goofy. And the tone of a track like that is at least slightly indicative of many parts of the Knife and Fever Ray catalogs. But it's also the kind of thing that's only most off-putting when you first hear it. You do get used to their vocal presence with enough time. Anyway, in researching this video, I've now finally gotten around to hearing the Knife and Fever Ray discographies, which are both pretty small. The Knife only had 4 studio albums, technically, and Fever Ray only has 3. But for the most part, I enjoyed what I heard. The Knife's first 2 albums, their self-titled and deep cuts, were some pretty fun and catchy collections of quirky and playful synth-pop bangers. Between those 2, I think I slightly prefer the self-titled. That one track where Karen announces, "I'm Darth Vader," in an otherwise cutesy voice sticks out in my mind as kind of funny. Although Deep Cuts was the record that really blew the duo up to a wider audience, with tracks like Heartbeats and Pass This On having gotten a lot of attention. And I suppose the production on that album is a little better, more full-sounding compared to the first one. Their final album, though, Shaking the Habitual, meanwhile, that was quite handily my favorite of their albums. That showed them ditching most of the synth-pop frameworks they came up in altogether in favor of way more open-ended and abstract, like, ambient and techno-influenced arrangements, including a 20-minute drone piece in the middle, and a whole bunch of overtly left-wing political lyrics elsewhere, talking about the environment and gender politics and blasting the destructiveness and wastefulness of our current capitalist systems, right down to the album title alluding to doing away with the habits of society that uphold the status quo. Boy, is that shit aged remarkably well. I do understand how the length and structuring of that one could be a bit on the overindulgent or overlong side for some people, but that shit was practically designed to appeal to my sensibilities directly. The 3 Fever Ray albums, meanwhile, those feature, like, instrumental palettes that tend to take more influence from the moodier and icier tones of 90s IDM and the Warp Records' artificial intelligence sound, compared to the Knife's kinda brighter and flashier synth-pop tones. Although, other than that, it's pretty much more stuff in the same vein as the Knife, with the same kind of mildly shrill and abrasive but not unapproachable vocal deliveries, lyrical subject matter, and general confrontational attitude. I'll agree with the general consensus that the first Fever Ray album was the best and the one I'm most likely to keep around. Pretty much agree with the hype that most people have leveled at that one, found the vaguely early Aphex Twin-like atmosphere of it to be the most immersive. Although the other two Fever Ray albums, Plunge and Radical Romantics, hit me in largely the exact same way as the first one, weren't too far away in terms of personal enjoyment. I have not heard any of the work that Olaf Dreyer has released on his own. He's put out a smattering of EPs and loose track, both under his real name and under the name Oni Aihun, though that stuff hasn't gotten the same kind of attention as the solo work of his sibling, so I don't know, let me know if I'm missing anything essential there. Though I'm not here to talk about projects like those, the record that was actually requested for me to be covering was The Knife's third album from 2006, Silent Shout, which by pure coincidence is right about to celebrate its 20th anniversary like a week from now. Silent Shout is kind of the midway point between the more straightforward synth-pop approach of The Knife's first two albums and the more unhinged experimental approach of Shaking the Habitual. This really stuck out for people at the time because while The Knife's first two albums had a somewhat cheerful and playful vibe to them, Silent Shout really changed things up by going much darker in tone, showed them leaning into, I guess, slightly more abrasive melodic structures and more off-putting vocal effects. And by vocal effects, I pretty much just mean pitch shifting. I feel like out of all the albums in the greater The Knife sphere, this may or may not be the one that gets the most acclaim of them all, frequently discussed as a proper synth-pop classic and given like 10 out of 10 retrospective reviews. Pitchfork even marked it as their #1 best album of 2006. Certainly, I can see how the approach to this one would have really stuck out from the crowd at the time, going out of its way to be creepy and off-putting, but still aligning itself to otherwise easily accessible and simplistic stripped-back synth-pop structures. And I get how it would stand out retrospectively as well, kind of being that average midpoint of everything in the Knife universe has been, arguably their most defining and indicative work that most tells you what this band is about at their core. And also, out of the 7 records that I have heard from The Knife and Fever Ray while researching this video, I think Silent Shout might be my personal least favorite. Look, I can easily respect everything this album does and represents, and I do understand why lots of people would consider this their favorite Knife or Knife-related project. There's not too much for me to openly criticize here, especially in terms of the lyrics, which are all great across the board, and show their sharper instincts for social commentary. Though, sonically, this one kinda hit a less interesting, I guess kinda anti-sweet spot for me in their catalog, of neither having the same upbeat playfulness of their earlier stuff, or the more interesting and well-textured instrumental flares of the work that would follow, either on Shaking the Habitual or on the Fever Ray albums. This one, in comparison, feels more plain and rudimentary to me on an instrumental level, but also with the slightly more creepy and intentionally off-putting approach to the vocals and melodies, and especially the reliance on just regular old pitch shifting that didn't really appeal as much to me. I mean, it's still generally cool, it just had the feel, I guess, of a transitional effort to me, where I felt like I had less to personally latch onto in terms of my own tastes. Except nobody views it to be like a transitional effort. Most people see this as their best one, I don't know. Take the way the album starts with the title track. On one hand, pretty neat collection of, I guess, some mildly Giorgio-esque synth arpeggios that have a particularly chilly affect to them, and some lyrics about personal anxieties, and one line where Dreyer references their non-binary gender identity. This came out years before Dreyer came out as non-binary and still identified as a woman, so that reference is kind of presented as a sort of insecurity in their mind, maybe. It's generally nice, but pretty spare and stripped back, and I'm not crazy about the way the vocals are implemented with their voice like layering on top of itself in some kind of like weird, messy sounding G major sort of effect. I get how that could be fitting for the subject matter, but it's not the kind of thing that really pulls me in that much personally. It's just kind of a track that's there, doesn't really elicit that strong feelings out of me one way or the other. This kind of dichotomy is a bit of a running theme across the album. A lot of tracks where I can respect what they're going for and understand why they made the choices they did, but aren't really that fun for me to listen to, or maybe have some sonic idea that prevents me from getting into it as much as I'd like. Tracks like Na 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 and the closer Still Light both express quite dark lyrical themes. The former expresses the desire to chemically castrate rapists. Very nice. And the latter loosely goes into like a brief anecdote that seems to be about self-harm. Although sonically, they're really simplistic, like ambient adjacent synth pieces that have the feel of lightweight interludes. And Na 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 in particular stands out for pitching Karen Dreyer's already fairly high-pitched voice up even further to a somewhat comical degree that makes it difficult to even make out anything they're saying, and I'm like, I get how it's intentionally portraying, like, a fragile and understated image to mirror how women are perceived in society and, like, I guess be a semi-ironic juxtaposition for how the lyrics are. But again, sonically it just kind of bounces off me. I'm just like, not really feeling this. Some of the album's louder moments also end up hitting me in a similar conflicted way. We Share Our Mother's Health has some pretty dang on-point commentary about the destructiveness of colonialism on the global south, and how capitalism often acts at odds with environmentalism, only allows for efforts for the Mother Earth to heal if those in power can financially get something out of it, and also how capitalism often comes from the attitude of always thinking the world is about to end soon, so we need to get ours first and fuck everything else. Boy, is that depressingly evergreen in its messaging, only gets more relevant with each passing year. But sonically, it's a bit of a clusterfuck, with lots of blaring and kind of obnoxious synth textures, more like kinda G major adjacent vocal layering, intentionally kinda ugly sounding pitch down vocals, and just overstuffing itself with just kinda all around garish aesthetics. And again, the garishness fits for the subject matter, but I don't know, man. It's just a bit much to actually listen to. Though if you want easily the most glaring example of this dichotomy for me, you have the penultimate track, One Hit. The idea behind this track is absolutely inspired, partially written from the perspective of a domestic abuser, and using that framing to make points about the overwhelming presence of misogyny baked into society, and how abuse is so often tolerated. A guy hitting a woman and expecting to get a kiss in return. Points about how filming otherwise pornographic and exploitative material would be elevated to high art just if a prestigious male director does it with lights and a bit of a twist. And my god, the line, spending time with my family like the Corleones, holy shit. But all of these great ideas are overshadowed for me by the fact that I fucking hated the chorus on this track and found it to be ridiculously overbearing and annoying. Ho 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 ho. Yeah, no, I fucking could not deal with that shit. And the super pitched down parts too, like, Jesus, that sounds like ass. And worse still, that hook is also easily the catchiest part of the album by far. All the good parts of this track are going to be excised from my head immediately when that ho 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 comes in. I totally understand the people who would call this one of the best or even the best track on the album. I don't think the track is bad either, but that chorus alone made it probably my least favorite cut here, sorry. Though, if it is my least favorite track, it's not really by that much, if that. The distance between my enjoyment of my favorite and least favorite moments on this thing is not all that pronounced. If you want some examples of tracks that did hit a fair bit better for me, tracks like Neverland and Like a Pen are more prototypical in following the Knife's, I guess, earlier synth-pop formulas, with Karen Dreyer delivering their vocals at more the natural pitch you'd be used to without any pitching up or down. And both are solid bangers with mixes of blaring synths and drum machines that do hit quite hard. Neverland being a track written from the perspective of a stripper who is being disrespected by her patrons but still relies upon their money. And Like a Pen, I think, is about, like, women's anxiety about their bodies and, like, all the work towards their appearances required just to get them to fit in. Beyond that, From Off to On is probably my favorite of the lower key moments. The bubbly synth instrumental of that one feels predictive of the ideas that would show up on the first Fever Ray album. As one of the more memorable tunes here as well, even though it is so low-key. Kind of like the mysterious edge to that one. Beyond that, Marble House is one of the more dynamic synth instrumentals, but doesn't get as overbearing as other moments here with that. The tune is one of the strongest here as well, and that chorus is pretty soaring. And similar thoughts on the track Forest Families, which kind of hits a similar note, and also benefits from lyrics seemingly like about religious communities isolating themselves from society and enforcing strict gender roles, like women not being allowed to know how to read and stuff. There's also one interesting line that really stuck out to me. They said we had a communist in the family, so I had to wear a mask. Though the track that I thought was the most interesting on an instrumental was probably The Captain, since the entire first half of that track is nothing but ambient synths before it builds into this especially chilling and lonely synth-pop tune in its second half. Karen's vocals on that one are pitched up a bit, which is a little grating, but the underlying tune works well enough to get away with it. I think that might be my favorite cut here, though again, not by much, if that. So yeah, I think that's about all I have to say on the topic of Silent Shout. Very much the definition of an album I want to like more than I actually do. There's certainly no lack of substance, interesting ideas, really smart and on-point lyrics. I get exactly why it got the level of praise it did back in the day. But it's still the kind of thing that I listen to and I'm like, that was neat, without really going the extra mile for me, I guess. As much as I like the lyrics on this album, I'm not typically the kind of guy who listens to music specifically for lyrics. I'm always drawn a lot more to instrumentals. And while these instrumentals were all fine, I don't think they sound as interesting as other moments in their catalog. Not to mention the parts of this album that I don't like as much were the parts that probably left the most memorable impact. Also, yeah, for the record, I did spend quite a bit of time with this one trying to get it to click more with me, since even a lot of the album's most rapturous reviews also qualified it, saying that it wasn't the kind of thing that hit them right away on first listen. Though, while it did grow on me a little after the first listen or two, it wasn't by that much. I don't dislike this album by any stretch. At the absolute worst, I think it's just decent to pretty nice. And I do get exactly how other audiences might even get some crazy 10 out of 10 experience out of this. But this is probably the album of theirs that leaned the hardest into the elements of their sound that didn't really appeal to me as much, and away from the elements of their sound that pulled me in more on other albums. So, there you go. There's other projects from these guys that I can see myself keeping around, like Shaking the Habitual and the Fever Ray self-titled, but this particular one, I think I'm just stopping it. Like, I respect this from a distance without it really resonating with me on a deeper level, and I'm overall feeling a strong 6.5 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.